Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We'll just wait for a few minutes while we let everybody in. We have a good crowd. Good evening. Welcome, everybody. We're just going to wait for a few minutes longer while we let everybody get in. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. We'll just wait a couple more minutes and then we'll just go ahead and get started. We want to make sure that we're get through the information and have time for questions. All right, welcome everybody. I think to respect everybody who has gotten here on time, we'll get started. I'm Lily Thomas. I work with the Marin County Community Development Agency, where I am a Deputy Director over Housing and Federal Grants. And one of the projects that I'm working on is the housing element. I'm joined tonight by two of my team who are going to be helping with the presentation and answering questions in the chat throughout the presentation. If you want to introduce yourself, starting with Jillian.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jillian Zeiger. I'm a senior planner in the Housing and Federal Grants Division.
And hi, everyone. My name is Aline. Happy to be here with you tonight. I'm a planner with the Housing and Federal Grants Division.
Thank you both. I think we're also joined tonight by Supervisor Arnold, who will be here just listening to your comments, as well as Commissioner Dickinson from the Planning Commission. So welcome both of you and thank you for being here. Did you do the poll? Is the poll ready to?
I did the poll.
Okay, great.
Let me share. I can share.
Can we see the results? All
Sure.
right. So look at all of you who have made it to 5+ meetings. Good on you. So for those of you who have been to many of the meetings, some of the information that you're going to hear tonight, it may be repetitive, but we feel like before we get into, let's go to the agenda, please. Before we get into talking about the new sites, it really helps to set the context. So some of you who've been to the 5+ may be able to give the presentation for me, but so we're going to start. I'm going to give an overview about the housing element that some of you have heard before. We're going to talk a little bit about the site selection process, and then we're really focused on the new sites that have been added, and then we'll talk about the next steps. So let's go to the next slide, please. Also, sorry, given the number of people that we have, we're going to be taking questions in the chat, and time permitting, if there is additional time at the end, we'll try to take some comments and questions at the end. So the housing element is part, can we go back to the other side? Okay, sorry, the goals. Let's go back to the goals. All right, so our goals tonight are just to inform you about the new sites that are under consideration and provide an opportunity for you to give us your input on these new sites that are under consideration. Next slide, please. So we're here tonight to talk about the housing element, which is part of the county's general plan. It's updated every 8 years and required by California state law, where it's certified by the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, and it must be adopted by January of next year. And we're here to talk about the unincorporated areas only, although every city and town in Marin are also updating their housing elements, as well as everybody in the Bay Area. Next slide, please. So the The Regional Housing Need Allocation, or RHNA for short, is what governs the process of the number of homes that we need to plan for. And in this cycle, this 8-year cycle that we're talking about tonight, the Bay Area will be planning for about 441,000 new homes. And of that 441, about 3% or 14,000 are assigned to all of Marin County and its cities and towns. And then our share in the unincorporated part of the county is 3,569 homes. And the RHNA is determined by the state based on a combination of factors, including population growth, job growth, and unmet need for housing in the past housing element cycle. Next slide, please. Can you have the next slide, please? Uh-oh, it looks like Aline's frozen. Jillian. Sorry about that. We're just having a little technical issue for the moment. I think, can you log into?
I think I can share my screen. Let me pull up
Okay.
the presentation.
All right. All this time that we're doing it, we've got it down. It's just a technology thing. It's not that we haven't figured it out yet. Oh, I get to see everybody for a minute.
Apologies, my internet cut out. But
Yeah, that's okay. I think that Jillian is, do you have it now,
That's
Jillian?
Aline. She's got it. No,
Oh, Aline has
got
it. Okay, great.
Apologies.
Okay, no problem. So before we start talking about the sites, we wanted to really look at what are the number of homes that we have in the unincorporated county. So we have about almost 30,000 homes in the unincorporated part of the county. And we have here, you can see by supervisorial district that most of those homes are in District 3, which is Southern Marin, and District 4, which is actually West Marin and includes parts of San Rafael, Larkspur. So it's that area. So, and you can see that District 5 has the smallest percentage of homes in the unincorporated part of the county. So again, this is just the unincorporated part of the county, and just interesting to look at where those homes are. I was surprised by this. I thought that most of our homes were actually in District 2 and 3. Next slide, please. And if you wanted to see where those districts are, they're available on our map. I think Aline or Jillian could drop a link to a map that'll show where those supervisorial districts are. So as we're planning for housing, for those regional housing need allocation, we need to plan at all income levels. So that includes extremely low income, very low income, low, moderate, and above moderate. And when we're having that conversation, I think it's really important to look at what that means in this county. Because we are such a wealthy county, we have a very high median income, because it's based on what that median income is. So a family of 4 in this county making $146,000 can qualify as low income. So when we're having this conversation about housing at all income levels, I think it's important for us to contextualize it within what that means in this county. Next slide, please. So as we start to determine where the sites are going to be and how we're going to select sites to meet those housing needs at all income levels, we start with what the state's requirements are. And the state has gotten really specific this cycle. And they look at things, for example, what are the existing uses on the site? Could those uses be a barrier to developing housing? And then they look at what the realistic potential for development and redevelopment are on those sites. They look at the size of the site, and then we look at development density as a proxy for affordability. So for us to be able to count a site towards meeting our affordable housing requirements, it needs to be at a certain density. Next slide, please. So as we're looking at those density assumptions in the site inventory. Things to meet are above moderate, might be what we would consider, a large home on a lot, or a single home built on its own lot. Could be some. And then as you move into the moderate income, that's usually attached homes, duplexes, fourplexes, things like that. Accessory dwelling units can be counted towards moderate or lower income units in some cases. And then for most of our lower income units, we need to look at multifamily, denser housing because of the cost of development and how expensive land is. It's really important that we are, to make it feasible, you need to develop at a higher density. Next slide, please. So with this challenge in mind, we went to the board and planning commission for a joint workshop back in December with these guiding principles that they approved for us to use as we started that process of identifying sites. So looking at ensuring that there was housing in housing was distributed in all of our communities. Really that we looked at addressing racial equity and historic patterns of segregation, which is a new requirement under this housing element, where we really need to what's called affirmatively further fair housing. So we need to look at those patterns of segregation in our community and have policies and programs, and every lens that we look at our housing element needs to look at that. So that was one of the guiding principles that they asked us to look at. They also said to look at encouraging infill and redevelopment opportunities, looking at environmental hazards that are identified in the safety element, which is also being updated. Also looking at leveraging surplus lands and ensuring a robust public engagement around sites. So doing, community meetings like this to ensure that people were aware of what was under consideration and had opportunity to comment on it. Next slide, please. So as we look at the site selection process, we have started with this kind of larger list of almost 150 sites. We looked at those guiding principles, narrowed it down to some scenarios, and asked for public comment along each of these ways. And we looked at a couple of different alternatives, got feedback from the board and planning commission, and then it ended up with one recommended list of sites that we took on March 15th. And got some additional feedback from the board and planning commission at that level. Next slide, please. So for each of our sites, as we are looking at them, we've looked at these different strategies around looking at, is there vacant residentially zoned parcels that we could develop additional housing on? Are there any approved projects that haven't yet been built? Those we can get credit for. They're called credit sites. Looking at accessory dwelling units as one of the ways that we can meet our housing need. It's not going to meet all of our needs, but it is one of the tools that we're looking at. Looking at some publicly owned parcels that are that could be used for housing. And an example of that is a parcel that's owned by the state in unincorporated Larkspur, and there's some housing that's being proposed on that site. We've also looked at increasing densities in existing residential areas and rezoning or upzoning some commercial sites to allow mixed use on them. Looking at places where religious institutions might have excess room on their parking lots. There's a long history in this county of our religious institutions developing affordable housing on them. There's a lot of those examples. And so looking to see if there's any additional opportunities for that. Looking at some of our school sites, for example, there's a number of schools with shrinking enrollment, and looking to see if there is any way of adding housing, especially for teachers and staff on those. And then looking for opportunities to convert either existing multifamily housing or commercial property to permanent affordable housing. Next slide, please. So we are here tonight to talk about some new sites. As I said, when we started the process in January, we had identified about 150 sites and have gone since then. So the past 3 months, we've been doing a lot of public outreach on them. And then in March, when we went to the board, they asked us to reduce the number of homes on some sites and to remove some others and to add some additional sites. And so based on that, we have a list of new sites that are under consideration that haven't been out in the public, and we haven't had an opportunity to review them with you. So we wanted to make sure that we did that tonight. Those new sites are in Atherton area and in the San Geronimo Valley. And if you'll go to the next slide, of course, you can't see this very well, but this is the new list of sites that I'll just go over at a high level. And in a little while, in just a minute, Aline is going to walk us through the sites on a map. So in the San Geronimo Valley area, we've added the Woodacre Fire Station, the St. Cecilia Catholic Church, Forest Knolls residential area that is right along Drake. And we've also added in the Atherton area a site on Atherton Avenue at 350 Atherton Avenue. Also another one at 618 Atherton and 654. So in that Greenpoint corridor, as well as 50 H Street, 5 Harbor Drive, 55 Harbor Drive, 35 Harbor Drive, and 11 Harbor Drive. And this was to accommodate removal of a site in this area, in the San Geronimo Valley area, and reduction in the Atherton area, reducing the density on the proposed sites. And so because the density was reduced, we needed to add some additional sites. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is the overview of all of the sites that you can see that we've selected sites throughout the county. And that was one of the guiding principles, is really looking at finding some opportunities within all of our communities. Next slide, I think, is, so this is just again, the map of them. So Aline, let's just go to the next steps and then we'll switch back for you to take it to the map. So just before we go, Aline can be pulling up the map, but just to let you know that after tonight, we'll take some questions and feedback, and then we'll be asking the board and planning commission to review policies and programs on April 12th. And that'll be happening at 2 o'clock. An updated notice, I think, has gone out about that. And then the sites that we'll be asking for confirmation that these are the right sites at 5 o'clock on the 12th. And then after that, those sites would go into environmental review. So, you know, again, even once the board says this is the right list of sites, it's not finalized until they adopt the housing element next fall in this fall after the environmental review is complete. Okay, so let's go to the map. Aline, if you don't mind, if you want to go ahead and pull that up so that we can just show where those sites are. And it looks like we'll have plenty of time for taking comments and questions. So I'm just going to mute Aline if you want to.
In the Atherton area.
Great.
Great. So let's start here. Okay. So here we've got the property, 55 Harbor Drive, and you can see there are the number of potential units situated on the left side of the screen here. So this has 43 proposed moderate units. There is, looking for the address, 35 Harbor Drive with 15 moderate units right next to the other site at 55. We've also got 11 Harbor Drive directly adjacent as well with 22 units, and 6 on another parcel there with that same address. And then the site of Rossi's Deli is also identified here with 7 units of moderate units. And then moving down down Atherton Avenue. We've got 350 Atherton Avenue with 40 units. Down a little bit more, H Lane, 21 units. And then the two parcels here for 654 and 618 Atherton with 37 and 34 units. And those are the sites identified, new sites identified for the Atherton area. We'll also put the link for this map in the chat so that you can explore yourselves. And you'll see that there are actually two layers here for the site. So you can deselect the top one, which includes all the universe of sites, and just select the second layer to see just the new sites. So that is the Atherton area. And then moving over to the San Geronimo Valley. We have here the fire station on several parcels. So we see 20 units, 12 and 6 between the three of them for the Woodacre Fire Station. Moving west down San Geronimo, we see here 6760 Sir Francis Drake with 30 units of lower income housing. And then moving down east, the St. Cecilia Church with 13 units of moderate income housing. Jillian or Lily, anything else to add between the two areas?
Yeah, I would just say that Forest Knolls site actually is being considered for moderate income because it's next to, with our requirements to affirmatively further fair housing, it's next to the only two deed restricted affordable housing projects in the valley. And so that's an example of what that means, that one of our goals is to ensure that all of the affordable housing in the community isn't concentrated in the same area. And so that site is actually under consideration for moderate. But I don't have anything other to add. So Jillian, should we go to questions? We could probably just turn this. I think we're done with the presentation unless we wanted to have it at a higher level. We could, Jillian, if you want to go to.
Yeah, I'm happy to reshare if needed, if we need to reshare.
Great,
yeah,
thank you.
I'll start at the top, and I'm going to share some questions that I've already answered, but I think it would be good for others to hear. If you have any other questions, please type them into the chat. I'm not sure with almost 100 people if we're going to be able to get to verbal comments. So let's see. There was a question in here about how we're counting ADUs. Let's start with that one.
Okay, great. So ADUs are counted toward our RENA based and the way you do it is you look at your history of how many you have developed in the past planning cycle, and then you can project them out for the future. And so we will be counting ADUs based on our history of developing ADUs, and then the affordability is based on a survey that we did to look at the affordability of our ADUs. And so we can use that to demonstrate the affordability that we can project for the new units.
Thanks. Okay, Sandra is asking, why aren't you considering sites in the unincorporated areas of Western Novato, for instance, along Maclay, Wilson, and Indian Valley?
So we looked at a variety of sites where that meet the criteria that we needed for HCD. So we look at the size of the site, we look at the proximity to transit, to infrastructure services, as well as looking at environmental constraints that may be on those sites. So I can't speak to an exact specific site, but that's the criteria that we use when we are selecting sites, as I kind of laid it out in that chart, that we looked at all of those variety of different ways of meeting our housing needs.
Okay. Brian is asking, 2 property owners on this list told me they had no idea their properties were being targeted. Are those eminent domain scenarios?
The county would not use eminent domain. It's not involved in any of these proposals. So this is really first of all, This is a zoning exercise. So the county would be looking at the zoning possibility. And if a site is included on the housing element sites list, there isn't a requirement that the property owner develop it. That would be at their option. So we are looking for, obviously if a property owner or a developer is looking at developing a site, that means that it's more likely to develop. That's something that the state would look at. But to be clear, there's no eminent domain, and there's not a requirement that somebody develop if their site is included in the housing element.
Okay. Layla is asking, how do you figure that the recommended list has 82 sites when there are over 100 sites in Los Ranchitos alone? Each of these homes is a site with a property owner / taxpayer.
Yeah, so some of the sites that we grouped them. So sometimes if a site has multiple parcels or it is an area, they were grouped. So and that was the previous one that the board was that we brought to the board on the 15th. We don't have a finalized list for the 12th yet, but that's why some of them were grouped when there was multiple parcels.
Okay, thanks. And Peter is asking, it says new candidate sites continued, but we didn't see any previous sites.
The previous sites are available on our website. Aline, if you'll drop that into the chat, the map for that. We also showed it on that overview. It was at a high level. It had all of the sites throughout the county. Those are all also available on our website. There's a number of iterations of it, but all of that information. So if this is your first meeting, my apologies, we've kind of jumped into it, but if this is the first time that you're engaging with it, all of that information is on our website, and please take a look. And there's an email address that you can ask us questions if you have about that existing sites list.
I mean, there are some questions here about, which sites have been removed, which sites have been added. How do we find out what these sites, what level and density of housing? So, Aline can put a link in the chat so that you can subscribe. We don't, as Lily said, we don't have the final list. So I'm going to move on to some other questions. Pat is asking, how do you choose the sites? Are these sites currently on the market?
So the way we choose the sites, if you'll remember that slide that I said, we looked at a variety of categories. We looked at vacant residential land. We looked at underutilized land. We looked at commercials, properties that may be able to accommodate additional housing. We looked at church sites, school sites. So really, with this larger number of homes that we're planning for than we have in the past, we looked at a variety, many different ways of and categories of housing. The property does not have to be for sale. It doesn't have to be that the person is currently seeking to develop it. The county's role in the process is to make sure that the zoning that could accommodate additional housing is in place, and that we have programs and policies that would support that.
Okay. Mary is asking, are these new sites in addition to the Olive / Atherton sites proposed before?
Yes, so these are new sites. At the workshop on the 15th with the board and the planning commission, there was a number of sites where the density, it was suggested by the board members that the density be reduced, or a number of sites that be removed. And so to accommodate the housing that we need to plan for, when the density was reduced, that meant that we needed to add some additional sites. So these would be additional sites because the density in that area was reduced from 30 units to 20 units an acre.
Liliana is asking, how are you going to help homeowners build ADUs? Is the county going to offer a special program for homeowners to build them and also deal with the increase in septic costs? You want me to answer this?
Yes, that would be great if you answer
that. So we're, in addition to the sites list, we're also developing policies and programs, and those will also be presented to the Board of Supervisors on the 12th. We had a workshop on Tuesday all of the slides from the workshop are available on the website, and these are great ideas that we will take into account. But we already have some program ideas around facilitating ADU development, especially as it relates to septic, but also just the development process in general of ADUs, because we recognize that that's a great way to provide more housing. Someone asked how many sites from the previous RENA cycle are still possible to be developed. One of the meetings said practically none of the previous cycle sites had been developed.
That's accurate. So of our previous housing element, I think 1 or 2 sites were developed. One or two of our smaller sites were developed. So most of our sites actually for the past 2 cycles can be reused. However, we have a much larger number of homes that we're planning for this cycle. And so even with utilizing all of reusing those sites, we still need to add some additional sites because our arena has gone up significantly. So, but yes, we are looking at those as possibilities also.
James wants us to address the drought related issues and water shortages, wildfire danger, additionally issues with traffic along Sir Francis Drake Boulevard.
Yeah, so the question around water is something I'm sure that many of us are thinking about, as well as fire. And those would be studied, as would traffic. All of those will be studied through the environmental review. As many of you may know, we're also updating our safety element, which is the safety element really looks at how our community is going to address the impacts of climate change and those kind of natural hazards associated with climate change. So we're also updating the safety element at the same time. And we have a workshop with that's coming up, I think on the 5th. Is that right, Jillian?
Yes.
Okay, there's a workshop on the 5th about with the safety element. That's also on our website. I think Elaine could drop something in a link to that. So that's a good place to talk about those concerns, but we'll also be studying all of those things through the environmental review, and those will be considered before any site is actually finally adopted into the housing element.
Thanks. So Eileen wants to know if that site in Forest Knolls is on the farm stand or next to it.
It's next to it. As you face the farm stand, it's to the left of it.
Great. Michelle wants to know what income levels are the properties at 350, 654, and 618 Atherton Avenue being considered for. I can answer this. We'll have an updated list with all of the income levels for those sites available soon. Next question, is the proposed development at the Fireman's Fund site included in these countywide numbers? I can answer this too. So that's an incorporated Novato, and this housing element that we're talking about tonight is for the unincorporated areas, but every city in town is also doing a housing element. So it's a great suggestion for the city. Let's see. Is it true that the current Tamalpais site with about 50 acres used to belong to the Flanders family, but was taken by eminent domain by the county? If that's the case, why was this land never returned to the Flanders family?
That property is owned by the Tamalpais Union High School District. I don't know the history of how it came into their ownership, but it originally was going to be a high school when there was a large development planned in the San Geronimo Valley. It's my understanding that the Flanders family currently leases that property from the Tam Union High School District. But there's just to clarify, sorry, Jillian, just to clarify, there's no eminent domain proposed as any part of the county's housing element.
That's good clarification. So Susan wants to know if there's no possibility of eminent domain. Marin, obviously, oh, that's more of a comment, sorry. The new sites on Harbor Drive are adjacent to Route 37 entrance ramps. Again, escape route for fire are feeding into Atherton. Has this been considered?
So all of the evacuation routes, traffic impacts will be studied through the environmental review. And so that is one of the reasons why we will be proposing more sites than and more units than what's needed, is we need to make sure that if there are hazards that are identified or constraints to development, that we could remove a site, and the board would have the option of selecting a different site to include. So all of those would be studied through the environmental review.
Thanks. Louise wants to know, does this mean that if a site has been identified but owned by the owner, that the owner has to agree to your plan, and what happens if they do not?
So the county's role is to set zoning and land use policy, and the board, the planning commission and the board set land use and zoning rules. If a property owner chooses to develop the property, that's at their option, but it's really the board and the planning commission's role to set zoning and land use policies. If a property owner wants to develop at the densities and consistent with the housing element, they would be able to, but again, it would be at their option.
Thanks. There are two questions that are really similar, so I'll ask the first one. Does the county have any formal effort underway to oppose/revise the sky high housing unit targets, or has it essentially given up at this point?
The county went through the appeal process. The board directed staff to pursue an appeal through the Association of Bay Area Governments, ABAG. That's the process that you have for appeal. Marin, the county did that. It was not successful. I think that there was only one community, I think, that had a successful appeal. And so, no, it was not successful. There isn't any other appeal process available to the county at this point.
Someone wants to know what's the number of housing. So our allocation is 3,569 units. The breakdown of that allocation in terms of affordability, we can put, Aline can put a link in the chat to show you how those numbers break down in terms of low, moderate, above moderate income, et cetera. We're getting some really good public comment on the site. I just want to let everyone know that this will be part of the public comment. And also, we have a lot of questions, and if we don't get to your questions by 7, we will answer them, and we'll send you an email about that.
Also, while she's getting the next one, the comments that you are in the chat will be recorded, and those will be compiled as part of our public record. So if we don't get to addressing your comment that you have in there, we will be compiling that and using it in our process. Thank you.
Thanks. Pat is asking, will new developments be required to use reclaimed water?
So water, whatever the current standard, any new development would have to go under whatever the current standards are. If there's not enough water to meet our regional housing need allocation, if our water districts don't have enough water, then we're required by the state to have programs to address that. And looking at recycled water may be one of the ways to do that. I think that many of you may have heard me say, but our community doesn't do a good job of recycling it. And much of our fresh water, drinkable, potable water, is used for landscaping. And there's a lot of opportunities where we could be doing a better job of reusing recycled water, especially for landscaping on some of our large and institutional uses. So that could be an option for it. But, as there's new water requirements for reusing water and reducing landscaping, that would be included in any development. It's also notable that if we get to the point where we're restricting water hookups, that any affordable housing development would go to the front of the line and would be ahead of any other kind of market rate development. And that's under current state law.
Thanks. We have a question about the ADUs. So if ADUs are counting towards the arena, but it depends on trends in history, what does that mean for Marin?
Do you want to answer that, Jillian?
Sure. So we essentially have made assumptions about how many ADUs have been developed over the last housing element, just based on, so every year we have an annual report that goes to the state HCD to say how many units have been permitted, how many units have been built. And then depending on that trend over the last 8 years, we can project into the future how many of those units we expect in the future. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Lily.
No, I would say that, yeah, they're just based on the projections from the annual report. So I think you got it all.
Okay. Where on the Marin County website can we find the information related to ADUs and septic assistance? You mentioned a workshop was recently done. I can actually have Aline put a link in the chat. That was actually done through our ADU Marin initiative, which is all of the cities and towns except for San Rafael are took part in this website, as well as webinars, and we had people from EHS at the webinar, the unincorporated county webinar. So happy to put that link in the chat. Next question, is the Forest Knolls parcel what is now a mobile home park, or is it privately owned parcel with one home existing?
It's the latter.
Will environmental impact reports be required on any of these new sites?
So the county will be doing a programmatic level environmental review, and that means it's done at a higher level and looking at all of the kind of cumulative impacts. Depending on the site, it may require additional environmental review, and that would be determined when a development was proposed.
Okay. The next question is, what do you consider our biggest hurdle going forward?
That I think that you all could probably answer that just as well as I could, and it probably would, people feel very differently depending on what community they're in. But I would say that, you know, it's a challenge that we're all here together. You know, I think that we all know that there's housing challenges in our community. It's also a challenge for us to kind of stretch and grow. So and I think that hopefully we'll work together to figure it out. And it's not easy.
Thanks. How will you deal with the fact that insurance companies in the San Geronimo Valley will not insure any new buildings for fire? Would that alone not prevent new housing from being built?
I think that would have to be considered, and any impacts of fire related to evacuation would be considered also through the environmental review. And I'm sorry, I'm sounding a little bit like a stuck record, but that's really one of the answers to a lot of these kind of infrastructure related questions, that's going to be considered. So that would be part of that environmental review. And if there was sites that, are, as I said, some may be determined that they're not feasible through that process, and then they would be removed before the board adopted the final list in the fall.
Thanks. Someone is asking, is there going to be a second meeting to discuss these specific proposals?
So no, there's not another meeting to talk about these sites other than the board and planning commission do have a joint workshop on the 12th. There's two. At 2 o'clock, we'll be talking about programs and policies. And at 5 o'clock, we'll be talking about the sites. So that's an opportunity for you to provide additional feedback and comments and at that point.
Great. The next question is the affordable income requirements that the county's using from HUD or from the state?
They're from the state.
Okay. And the second part of that question was about the cities. So all of the cities and towns are using those same affordability levels. So someone is asking, how are developers selected and who receives the profits from selling these new homes, especially on county property?
So if if there was a development on county property, there would be an RFP that went out, or a request for proposals. There would be a process for evaluating them. And if it was on county land, it would likely be affordable housing. So that would be through a nonprofit. And the nonprofit housing develop organization would seek public funds, like tax credits is one of the main sources for developing affordable housing, because it actually costs more to develop affordable housing than you get for either selling or renting it. So it's typically, it takes a significant amount of public subsidy. If properties were on the private market, it would be up to the property owner to select a developer, and if they so chose, and any of the profits would be between the developer and the private property owner.
Thanks. Septic issues, including creek pollution, are a huge issue in the San Geronimo Valley for existing housing. How does the county propose to deal with that related to new development?
So any new development would have to meet the current requirements. So any current septic requirements, which are at a much more stringent than many of the existing homes, which have older or even, pre-existing septic systems that were not permitted. So they'd have to meet the new kind of more stringent requirements.
A question, has there been any active
He jumped out to
outreach
play with the Jolly Kids.
Has there been any active outreach to commercial corridor business property owners along any portions of an unincorporated Marin County to find an interest in redesign with mixed use, residential, commercial redesign options? And then the second question, would the county ever set aside funds or staff/consultants to provide design assistance?
So the first part of the question around mixed use in commercial areas, that was one of the strategies that we used. If you'll remember that slide, I talked about the different strategies, and looking at commercial and underutilized was absolutely one of the strategies. If you look along for example, in the Kentfield area, that's unincorporated. So along Drake and Kentfield, there's some smaller businesses that are near other multifamily. So those areas have definitely been looked at, and as an example, but many other kind of commercial areas throughout the unincorporated county, including in the western part of the county in some of our village core centers. So yes, that's definitely one of the strategies. And I think, what was the second part of the question? Sorry, I lost that.
If staff or if there's set aside, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we don't have, so we have resources. There's funding that supports affordable housing. The county has an affordable housing trust fund to help with affordable housing, specifically around design. Maybe Jillian, you could talk about the objective design standards as a tool that will be there to help with as far as the design side of it.
Yeah, so the objective design and development standards are being developed at the county, and they will be going to the Planning Commission, the Board of Supervisors this summer or fall to help not only with those sites that have to use objective standards, but could also help those who may not want to go through a discretionary review process. Someone is asking why we didn't consider the entire golf course property, given that the San Geronimo sites that we talked about tonight are close to existing private homes, some with limited ingress and egress.
So the golf course, it's my understanding that most of the golf course will have that's owned by TPL, the Trust for Public Land, and they intend to have a open space restriction on it. The site around the golf course, around the clubhouse, was previously on our sites list, and that is one of the sites that was suggested by the board to be removed. And so and that's why we have sought these other areas to add these additional sites based on that direction.
Great, thanks. Someone is asking again about the Fireman's Fund. that site is in incorporated Novato. It's not in unincorporated Novato. Therefore, it couldn't be considered for the housing element that we're discussing tonight. That's for unincorporated areas.
Yeah, so just to piggyback, just to explain a little further, we're talking about the county, but this is just the unincorporated county. So we're doing all this work, but then each of the cities and towns in the county is also doing the same exercise that we are. So they're all looking for places where they can develop housing. And it's often pointed out to us, the Fireman's Fund, the Northgate Mall, which are all both excellent places for housing, but we really need to look for housing. Our job is to look for places for housing in the unincorporated parts of the county. But those, I'm sure, will also be designated because the cities and towns also have large numbers of homes that they're planning for.
Can you explain to us, this is Nicholas Jolly.
Sorry, can you put your questions in the chat, please? The Greenpoint Nursery site on Atherton Avenue includes a substantial amount of seasonal wetlands and flood basin. Have you considered that in the allocation of numbers?
So the sites did look at some of those environmental constraints that are available through our mapping exercises, and additional studies would be done if a site is selected through the environmental review. But they did take into consideration things like creeks, slope, existence of wetlands, and then they looked at the whole parcel, and then it was shrunk down based on the part that was outside of those constraints. So yes, they were taken into consideration.
Okay. Sandra is asking, why don't you broaden District 5 site possibilities? You are fixing only on Atherton.
We think that we've looked throughout in the District 5 in the Novato area. Most of this area is within the city, so there's really limited areas that are in the unincorporated. We do also have the Buck Center, which is in the unincorporated Novato area. So we have looked in most of the parts that we could, but yeah, there's limited available sites in that area.
Aline, can you help me answer this question? So it's asking, what has the county been doing since the last supervisor meeting to let Marin residents know about this process and involve the community? But maybe you can talk a little bit about how outreach was done and what we did in terms of site roadshow since January.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did kick off in late January 20th with a large community workshop to go over the site's inventory at that time. And since then, we have been communicating to local community organizations, to other jurisdictions in the county to share in their newsletters, in addition to several HOA groups and representatives to disseminate this information. We conducted road shows that were very specific to each community. We held 10 in total over the course of late January through the end of February. And then from there, we have been continuously updating folks who have registered for previous meetings to keep them updated along the process. Anything else to add, Jillian, on that? Continuous communication.
Someone is asking any thoughts on creating more housing for seniors with limited incomes? I can answer this question. So the sites list, we're specifying development by income. However, we use our programs and policies as a tool for housing specific populations, including seniors. We talked about this at our workshop on Tuesday, but I can have Aline put a link in the chat for that workshop. And if you can look at the ideas we have around senior housing, and if you have any to add, please send us an email. Aline can put our email in the chat. You can also email us comments about sites to that email as well. Someone is asking if we can send an email with all the written responses to questions proposed in the chat today. Yes, we can. Let's see, there's some comments here. Question, why is the county still including A60 zoned locations?
There's two, I think there's two sites that are A60 zoning that includes the Buck Center and the Bowman Canyon site. And at this point, we have, we haven't received any direction to remove those sites. Those are under consideration. The Board and Planning Commission decide to remove those sites, we would need to put some of the other sites back on. So it's a balancing act. Those sites are near other residential uses. There is an interest for those, and they're, the if they were chosen, again, they would be studied through the environmental review, but the Buck Center, which is A60, though it's near Buck Center, the Buck Center site, it's A60, but it's also near the freeway. It is near other residential uses. It's really consistent with the development pattern that's happening within the city of Novato that's neighboring it.
Thanks. Does the county have the ability to cancel, disregard, or override current community plans?
So usually other policies in the countywide plan govern. There needs to be consistency between the countywide plan and community plans. And if there are examples in community plan where it's inconsistent with state law, given some of the new housing policies, then the county may need to do that. An example of that that you could think about is some of the restrictive covenants that are on our properties. And those are in many of our communities, restrictive covenants that say that we can't sell our homes to people of color. Those are obviously no longer legal. And they're not consistent with existing state law, so they're no longer legal. So if there's things in a community plan that say, for example, that you can't develop multifamily housing in that community, or really have constraints and limitations on multifamily housing, that's no longer consistent with state law. And so there may need to be policies that are included as we adopt the housing element that address those. So in some cases, yes.
There's a question, how will you coordinate with cities? Their site choices magnify the impact of yours. So I can answer this question. We meet with the cities and towns once a month to discuss the housing element, and we're actually meeting more often than that with all of our environmental review consultants to discuss the environmental impacts of the housing sites that each city and town is developing. It's 6:58 and we have, I'm thinking we have over 100 more questions or
That
comments
we haven't gotten to.
that we haven't gotten to.
Can you just take a few minutes and look and see if there's some themes without kind of getting the specific questions? If you guys will just see if there's a couple of themes so that we could make sure that we answered those. And then while you're looking at those, I just want to make sure that you know that we will look at all of these, we'll get answers to them, even if we don't all get it done tonight. But I don't know if we could stay on a little bit longer. I know, Jillian, you need to go, but maybe Aline, you and I could stay on a little longer. I'd like people to be able to get their questions answered if it looks like we could group them together. We'll also be able to make sure that you can come on the 12th, where there's more opportunity for you to provide feedback. It's less of a question and answer, but we will get answers to your questions, even if we don't get them all tonight. But if there's anything kind of key that you're seeing that we should answer.
Okay, sorry, that was actually, it said 100 questions, but that was all the questions that we got through. So
okay, good. Okay, good. All right.
We have a couple more though, and I can
Okay.
stay on for a couple more. So people are asking for more meetings where we can have, where they can have a dialogue. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I would say that, there'll be always more opportunities throughout the environmental review process. There's additional meetings that you'll be able to have. There's going to be meetings at both the Planning Commission and board joint workshops throughout the process. Then, of course, if any of these sites actually are, if these sites are included and there's development proposals on them, there would be, and at that point, I'm expecting that we'd be going and having in-person meetings. And if there was a development proposal, there would be community meetings around that. So, we'll also have the board meeting, as I mentioned. I think that kind of the in-person and online is a hard balance to make, because we found that with these meetings online, we have a lot broader representation of folks. Often, the board meetings are typically during the day, so we tend to get people who are not working, and so when we do them like this, we tend to have a wider representation of folks. We have some younger people that often participate that don't usually, and those are really the people who are going to be most impacted by the housing situation over the years. So, I appreciate that it's often good to be able to have more of a dialogue, but it's something that it's a balance, I think, that we'll be figuring out as we are moving out of, once we get to the point where we're moving out of the pandemic.
Someone asks, if you've already met the requirements in Novato, why are we adding additional housing?
I'm not sure what that means. So I think that what we're saying is that we had a number of sites proposed to accommodate housing. There was a desire to reduce the proposed density from 30 units to 20 units per acre. And when we did that, that meant that we needed to add some more sites, because if you have higher density, then you can have fewer sites. But if you have a lower density, then you need more sites. And so that's really what it came down to.
I know I'm off mic, but I just want to say before you wrap things up, beautiful and bravo to you ladies. Thank you so much for your professionalism and poise and hosting such an amazing sessions of meetings. It's not easy, but I want to say thank you so much for your grace and your diligence.
Okay. People are asking for, I'm not seeing any new questions here.
Okay.
So.
Well, I would like to thank everybody for coming. I really appreciate that people have spent the time. Kudos to those people who've been to 5 or more. Also kudos for you who are kind of the first people who are just engaging now. We really appreciate that you have spending the time to engage with us, to ask the questions. I think it was really thoughtful, good questions. And I think it's really important for you to know that no decisions have been made yet. Staff will be presenting a list to the board for their concurrence, for them to select sites to choose sites to be studied through the environmental review. Then we're going to go through that whole process. There'll be more time for input, and there'll be more workshops between the Planning Commission and the board throughout that process. And we appreciate everybody's comments and feedback, and please stay tuned. More to come. Thank you all. Good night.